Despite centuries of ill health and social inequality, the number of Indigenous peoples is growing, and more than ever before, many of those over 65 years are surviving into older age. However, for older Indigenous peoples, there is still an increased prevalence of chronic conditions which may be associated with lifestyle factors and are amenable to interventions that have the potential to improve the health and well-being of Indigenous peoples as they age. Rachel Quigley from the Healthy Aging Research Team at James Cook University joins us now to explain how improvements in longevity and ageing for Indigenous peoples will require a life course approach and community-led initiatives. Rachel says that aging well for Indigenous peoples is a holistic concept where connections to culture, land, and the wider community are integral. Hello and welcome to another episode of Ironing Out the Wrinkles. I'm your host, Ros McMaster.
And I'm your other host, Kate Shaw. Together, we're taking the age out of ageism, helping men and women move through the second stage of life with less fear. The Healthy Aging Research Team at James Cook University in Cairns recently published a paper titled Aging Well for Indigenous Peoples, a Scoping Review. Physiotherapist Rachel Quigley was one of the contributors. The team's research priorities focus on healthy aging and dementia risk reduction, primarily within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations of far north Queensland in Australia. Rachel has been working in the field of gerontology for over 25 years, both in Australia and the UK. She is currently doing a PhD that focuses on developing a framework for healthy aging in the Torres Strait. Rachel, hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
It's lovely to be here to chat to you both about the work that I'm doing, so thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important too, particularly given the statistics. But we're wondering, what drew you to study Indigenous ageing in the field of gerontology?
Well, like you said in the introduction, I work as part of the Healthy Aging Research Team. We're based up in Cairns in far north Queensland. The team itself is headed by a geriatrician, and like you said, I'm a physiotherapist. There's various other allied health disciplines that I work with on the team. I'd just like to point out, obviously, I'm not Indigenous myself, but we do have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, both clinicians and researchers that work on the team with us. So I've been providing, and part and parcel of that team, geriatric clinical services up in the region for the Torres Strait for many years. And we've been doing the research with those Torres Strait Islander communities for over 20 years now. But the research, or what drew me to be doing the research side of it, was when we're providing clinical services, there's often questions that come up. There's gaps in services. There's questions that we'd like to answer. And because, genuinely we're clinicians at heart, we want to try and improve the service that we're delivering. So then we kind of accidentally go down the research path to answer some of those questions that arose. So it's a combination of still doing clinical services, and my passion for many years has been aged care, but living in far north Queensland, there's a large population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living here. So it was pertinent that, we looked at everybody and we ensured that everybody was getting equal access to those services that are appropriate and fit for purpose. And there was many gaps that we felt as a team that we wanted to answer, and hence we started on this research journey.
That takes us into the next question. What were you wanting to achieve with the study? What were the aims of this particular study, which you've kind of just answered a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think going back a little bit, probably should just give a little bit of background as to why this particular study came about. And several years ago now, doing our clinical work, we noticed that there was potentially high rates of people living with dementia. So we conducted a large dementia prevalence study in the region, which meant that we went to the Torres Strait. We assessed over 300 older adults that lived there, looking for rates of dementia. So we were assessing their memory and their thinking, but we also looked at other problems associated with aging, such as falls, mood, incontinence, function. And it's when we were feeding back the findings of that large prevalence study back to people living in the region that the community said to us, Well, that's all very interesting, and we know that there are some of these issues here, but we want to flip it around and we want to focus on the positives of aging and take a real strength-based approach to looking to see how people can live well. And I think that is because despite having those high rates of dementia and some of the other problems of aging that I spoke about before, there are a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are aging remarkably well. And it's about looking at what they're doing well. Why is it that they're aging so well, and focusing and sharing on some of those stories. So we said to the communities, yes, we'll continue to do this work with you, but let's take a strength-based approach. Let's focus on aging well. So this framework that we're looking at developing, which involves some guidelines and some resources, but we're yarning with the communities to explore what is their priorities for aging well, what does aging well mean specifically for them as a community, and then taking some of those findings to work with health services to develop some best practice aged care services. And the first part of that study is always to have a look at the literature, what's already been published, what's been out there. And hence I did this scoping review. So a scoping review goes out and it gathers all the information, published articles or even reports or websites around aging well. So I was specifically looking for Indigenous aging, but not on the genomics and not on the cell biology. It was more about what those people's perceptions were of aging well. What were the facilitators? What were the enablers that enabled Indigenous people to age well? So we wanted to know that. What does aging well mean to you? We wanted, and we're not suggesting that all Indigenous people hold the same perspectives on aging, but we just wanted to know if there were some common similarities between those different Indigenous populations. We wanted to also know whether there was any significant differences between aging well for Indigenous and aging well for non-Indigenous people. And I think probably most importantly as well, we also wanted to look at the literature to make sure that this study hadn't already been done. When you go out and you're doing research, the last thing you want to do is being going out there and repeating studies that had already been done. And I guess the overall aim of that was to take some of those things that we found from the worldwide literature and help that to guide the work that we were doing in the Torres Strait, to give us a little bit of a focus or a starting point for this wider project of the framework of aging.
Well, and it really was an interesting study. It was such a good read. So I'll have the link to the study up on the bio when we upload it. So
yeah, I found it really interesting too. It was very, very enlightening. What were the synthesis of findings and can you explain that word synthesis, including those amazing four major themes that you discussed?
Yeah, so I suppose we looked at hundreds of articles, but we narrowed it down to just 32 articles that were of real relevance to the topic that we were looking at. So there was some articles that came out of the United States with their Indigenous peoples there, Canada. We had a few studies that came out of New Zealand, a couple out of Ecuador and Chile. There's Indigenous people in those countries. We found 6 that have been conducted in Australia, but they very much had an Aboriginal focus and weren't specific to the people in the Torres Strait. And they're 2 absolutely distinct cultural groups. So it's, well, there's nothing in the Torres Strait. Therefore, that's why we need to go and ask them about their perceptions. So when I talk about the synthesis of the findings, it was looking at all those different studies and pulling together what all of them found. And was there any common themes across all those studies? What were the similarities with the findings in the studies? What were some of the differences? So that word, yes, synthesis was kind of pulling together all of those 32 studies and saying what were the strong commonalities that were coming out across there. So we did go on to the findings. We did find many shared similarities actually across all of those Indigenous populations. There was things that were very, very similar in all of the studies that we looked at. And I think Indigenous people, like everybody, in the world. They want to age well. They want to remain active, healthy, and independent for as long as possible. But I think where the real difference between Indigenous aging and non-Indigenous aging lies is, from an Indigenous perspective, it's a more holistic view of aging, and they place great importance on their connections, and they bear influence on how well they age. So I'm talking about connections to their kin, their family, and their culture, their country, and their communities. So just as an example, some of the participants in the studies talked about how important it was to maintain strong ties with their family. Looking after their grandchildren gave them a great sense of joy, and it provided them with opportunities to pass on their cultural knowledge and traditions. And I think it gave them a sense of purpose, is in so much as they had a role in the family. And with that strong sense of purpose, that facilitated aging well. When we're looking at their connections to the community, which came out again globally across the world, that was very important as well. And I think connecting with community really gives them a sense of belonging. It made them feel valued as older adults, as they became teachers to the younger generation. They had that purpose again, that role, and felt valued. And in fact, I think that whole sense of cultural leadership came out very strongly as an enabler to them for aging well. And I think through that role of cultural leadership, those Indigenous adults, they felt needed and respected. And they talked about that gave them improved life satisfaction. And they gained a sense of accomplishment because they had purpose and meaning in their life. I think one of the other findings that came out as well that was quite strong around the world, and that was the importance of being on their traditional lands and surroundings, and that really promoted a sense of well-being for them. It signified not only that symbolic connection to their culture, but it provided them an opportunity for subsistence living. So I'll go into that a little bit more. When we're talking about subsistence living, we're talking about going back to some of the traditional ways of living from the land. So talking about going back, hunting and gathering food from the lands that they live on and in traditional ways. So some of the studies the participants talked about the joy and the benefits of going out gathering berries from the land. Other studies from Alaska talked about how important keeping fishing and eating the fish and surviving from the sea was important to them. And there were quite a few benefits of going back to this subsistence living. For a start, just engaging in some of those activities was really physically active. It took, a lot of physical activity to go out there and do that, which was beneficial for their overall health. I think it also provided them an opportunity to connect back to their culture, eating their traditional foods. They talked about how it also facilitated that connection back to their land and the environment. And also, they often went out doing these gathering and hunting activities with family and friends. And so it was a way of engaging with community and family that was strengthened as well. So a lot of the studies did talk about that importance of that land connection. On a little bit of a different note, another one of the findings that came out, and again was common to many of the participants, was the importance of having a good spirit. So participants talked about a good spirit providing a balance in life, giving them a sense of strength. And it was through their spirituality that provided some guidance on how to age well. So it was very important to them about having this good spirit. We talked about the spirit a lot. And I think equally on a similar note, the participants also referred to the importance of having good emotional well-being. That was really important for them as they aged. And it wasn't just their well-being and their sense of satisfaction. It was the sense of the whole community and family. So if their children and their families and their communities were happy and saying that they were achieving good satisfaction in life, then the older person, despite what was happening to them, they said, actually, I feel happy now. It was almost a job well done. I've raised a happy family and therefore I've accomplished something in life. and I'm succeeding. So that was quite significant that came out.
And you don't seem to be able to, they're all connected really, aren't they? You can't separate any of those findings there.
All of
They all work together and mesh together to create that happiness and that sense of emotional well-being.
Absolutely, and that's the sense of it being holistic. Not one single thing stands out. All of their relationships are intertwined between family and culture and country. It's that bigger approach to aging. It's not just about the individual. It's all of those relationships and how they work together.
Yeah,
So
and
a bit more
I can understand that whole connection to the land and how important that is. So, did part of the study or a different study actually look at the Indigenous peoples who live closer to city areas because they don't have the connection to land? Are they even having a lost connection to the elders within the community? And I imagine it would be fair to say the city dwelling Indigenous population would be not aging as well.
Absolutely, that connection. I mean, there were some voices that were city, urban dwelling participants, and some that were more rural and remote. And there's a section in the article around some of the challenges that people faced and the barriers to aging well. And it was very much about not being on their land, not being with their people, not being able to access traditional activities that they do. And I'll probably, I can touch on that now if you want.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think to start with, and kind of an overarching theme of some of those challenges that they faced. I don't think I really appreciated really just how much the impacts of colonization had on their ability to age well. And that's where that sense of loss of grief and loss of their connections really comes into play, that historical trauma that they've been subjected to and the impacts that that's had on their culture and language. I think that was really significant. And that, we talked about interrelated, that's very much intertwined with the social determinants of health. So what I mean by that is people's access to education and housing and transport, access to healthcare, they form the social determinants of health. And for Indigenous people, they are impacted by inequalities that arise from these social determinants of health, but intertwined and mixed in that is those impacts of colonization. And that actually was really challenging for a lot of the participants to age well in that context of all these barriers that have been put up by society and by historical trauma and policies of the past. Saying that though, it wasn't all about, doom and gloom and poor me. They were saying, yes, we've got these challenges, but we're learning to be resilient. We're learning to overcome some of those hardships and those challenges. And they very much focused on the positive side of it, saying that, yes, there's these issues, but you've got to take a positive attitude. You've got to be positive. You've got to face them head on. And one of the ways that we as Indigenous people are doing that is through the use of humour. So they talked an awful lot about using humour to build up their resilience and to face some of those challenges that lay ahead of them. So yes, there was the kind of the negatives, and yes, this is hard for them, but it was like, well, we've just got to tackle it head on, and we're going to get there, and we're going to be humorous about this on many occasions.
That reminds me of something really positive. I've noticed that the Aboriginal language is coming back. They're recording pop songs in Aboriginal, that beautiful language. It's very melodic. So I think that's a positive, that people are, even us in the Western society, are acknowledging the way that, they're beautiful words.
Yeah.
Teaching their young. Yeah.
Storybooks now being written that are taught in mainstream schools with the Aboriginal language. So and the language is so important to them. And yes, it's lovely that that's coming back. And certainly the work in the Torres Strait that we're doing, when we started it 20 years ago, the islands that we talked about had the Western names. We called them the Western names. We're moving away from that now. We're even in our non-Indigenous population, we're referring to those islands in the traditional names that they have. So
like
yeah.
Uluru.
Oh, that's so
Yeah.
good. Yeah. I mean, my sister worked in education and she spent a lot of time with Indigenous communities up north and, would stay with them in their family homes when she had to spend time there. And she just loved it. Yeah. The sense of community and family and connection and humor, and everybody was very laid back and nothing was too much trouble. And they were so hospitable. She really enjoyed it.
It is about trust, so they don't just open up to anybody that comes in. It's building those relationships, having somebody to speak on your behalf that says, hey, yeah, these white people are here, they know this person, they're here because of this. But once they bring you in, and they fully bring you in, and yes, it's the whole community is welcoming, and you get the shared food and you get to join in some of the activities. So yes, it's a very community driven, welcoming place to be when you're invited in to share that.
Yeah.
And the elders are so important too, aren't they?
Yeah. Very
Yeah.
important. So was there anything that actually surprised you about the findings?
Well, I think what surprised me, and I probably talked about that just then, was around those impacts of colonisation. I didn't really realise, and I won't go back repeating that, but it was around that area of the significance of that grief and that historical trauma on me. So I wouldn't say it surprised me, but it really, I kind of suppose, shocked me to hear some of those stories, that what they've been through, and removal from families, that stolen generation, and how that's historically then impacted on people aging. There's a lot of older adults now that are aging that were lived in institutionalized care. So all of that kind of
those wounds, yeah.
wounds, now very reluctant to go back into aged care because that's reminiscent of them living in homes when they were younger. So it's bringing out, it's resurfacing a lot of that trauma for them. So I wasn't surprised, but it's always shocking, I think, to kind of be confronted with the impact on the track of what happened when they were younger is affecting them now as they're
Yeah, we forget that.
Yeah, we
Yes.
do forget that. It's a real reminder, isn't it? And it's, developing resilience. I mean, they've been trying to develop resilience for years, haven't they?
I think it's a really wonderful thing that you've put a spotlight on this for us all to think about. Which I never did. Are there any what are the differences between non-Indigenous and Indigenous communities?
There was a lot of similarities, but there were a lot of differences as well between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And I suppose a couple of really significant ones that stick out to me that were strong from all of the studies that I looked at. And I think the first one comes down to it either being, it's the approach to aging, and either an individualist approach or a collectivist approach. So I'll try and explain that a little bit more. In a Western model, aging well is often termed successful aging. And the emphasis is really placed on that individual to how well they successfully age. So the success of individuals aging really comes down, it's attributed to that own individual's choices, their efforts, their behaviours as an individual, the decisions that they've made throughout the life impacts on how well they age. And I think this Western model is really quite medically orientated. So it describes somebody that's successfully aging as one that's living without chronic disease, one that's functioning cognitively very well and very physically active. It's a very medical-centered, individualistic approach to aging well. And what we found with this Western perspective of success, it's often associated with the gaining economic or material wealth from an individual. And that ideal of success really then is reflected in the lifestyles of those fortunate elite. Those are the people that have been able to access those resources in their life to enable them to make, in a Western perspective, positive life decisions, such as maybe good financial planning. So they've garnered their wealth because, oh, I've done so well, I'm so successful in getting all this money. They've maybe adhered to health promotion advice, which means now that they're living free from disease and disability. They're aging successfully. And I think it's these people that have had access to that are rewarded, and they're the ones that are deemed successful. And even this term successful is very
nebulous, isn't it? Yeah.
And it's those that find themselves in less favourable circumstances. I think they're the ones that experience that blame and neglect because they're not deemed to be successfully aging. And really, to summarise that, I think that concept of success or failure that categorises aging into this notion of winners and losers, it's not great. It's not a good way to go. Rather than successful aging, or even get rid of the word successful, just aging well, being on a continuum where there's no winners and losers. Yes, everybody ages differently, but it's not about being this successful, wealthy, fit, active volunteer. That's a very much a Western perspective of aging. On the flip side, from an Indigenous viewpoint or an Indigenous approach, it's more about a collectivist approach to aging. So really summarising what I was saying before, that it's about the health and well-being of the whole community, not just that individual, and the strength and the relationships that we talked about. There's not much emphasis put on each individual's own achievements. It's what the community have achieved, what the family have achieved. And the greatest sign for aging for them wasn't about accumulating wealth or health. It was about having strong connections. So those connections to culture, spirit, place, whole of community remain strong. That was indicators that they'd aged well. So I think that individualistic as opposed to collectivist approach was really significant and probably the most outstanding difference. But one that I kind of liked and what came out, and I enjoyed reading a bit more about that. And I think that's the way that society views older adults in their community. So in a Western culture, older adults are often depicted as being a bit of a socio-economic risk, a bit of a burden on society because they face frailty and decline. They're often seen as not really contributing much to the overall wealth of the economy. And I think, these views probably do what kind of goes some way to explain why people living in a Western society often seek to defy aging and prolong youth, because it's not a time when you're valued by your society. But it's completely the opposite from an Indigenous perspective. So that acquisition, as I said before, of material goods and wealth isn't important to them. The things that were important as what they accumulated over their life course was this accumulation of knowledge and their traditional values, passing on wisdom to the younger generations, being able to advocate for Indigenous voices. They were indicators that they'd aged well. And I think it was about trying to establish strong futures for the younger generation coming through. And through this cultural leadership and being holders of this knowledge, Indigenous adults in their communities are really regarded in high esteem, and they're shown a lot of respect. So they actually look forward to aging and holding those positions within the community. They reported taking joy in aging because for them it signified a time in life where they garnered respect and felt valued. So then it's, I want to age, I want to be in those positions of passing on and building futures for the younger generations, and they were respected there. And
it's so opposite to that now.
I like that.
It's shameful. It's shameful, isn't it? Really,
in our society, don't we?
Yeah. It's terrible. It's terrible. We really need to take a leaf, some education from the way the Indigenous communities are doing it, and we know that, but we're really slow to come around because we still are, like you say, we're self-focused. It's all about what am I doing as an individual and how successful am I being in aging well. And even in doing this podcast, you know, we're sort of promoting the sense of community and how important that is to aging well. And then I think, hang on a minute, it's been weeks since I've phoned my own father. What kind of a sense of community is that? You know, like, yeah, it's quite bizarre.
It makes you think, you know, what of our, as non-Indigenous people, motivations for aging well, and what are we actually achieving? And I think when we reflect back on that, we are not selfish, but it is very much about the me, you know, my health, my fitness, my wealth, my accomplishments, my volunteering in the community, rather than taking it from the receiver's end, I guess, and the whole community approach.
And the family, I like the idea how it's all about the team, the family, not one individual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I know when we sit around, you know, if we're all together with the grandchildren and the grandparents, and, you know, if, you know, we're always saying to my father, well, he likes to say, oh, back in my day, but when he tells the story about the way things were in those days, it's captivating, and, you know, the grandkids love hearing it, you know, rather than, yeah.
Your knowledge, whatever cultural society is sitting, it's about sharing stories from the past and passing on that knowledge and wisdom to make the next generation more appreciative and stronger, I guess, and that applies to all of us.
And well, is that what the yarning circles is about? I think there was something about the yarning circles and why they're important to Indigenous
elderly
cultures. Yeah.
Yeah, so when we did the scope review, we found that there were no studies done in the Torres Strait. So that's great. That means that, you know, it's accepted that we can go back in there and talk. So we are sitting and we're yarning with various Torres Strait Islander communities, just in a group, to talk about, you know, what are the strengths for you of aging well. And a lot of them are talking about, you know, already that, you know, the same things are coming out with me yarning is what we found in this global scope review. So they're talking about how important it is that they're maintaining their strong family units up in the Torres Strait. They're really wanting to push back, having that multi-generational functions together, being given the opportunities to pass on that cultural knowledge and tradition to the younger children coming through, and how important it is that they are caring for children and grandchildren. So that is very, very important to them, and very similar to what we found in the wider body of literature. We're going to take what they're telling us, and we're going to talk to health services about that, because the only way that you can provide appropriate health and social care services is understanding what the priorities are for each of those communities. So by gathering those yarning stories from the people in the Torres Strait, we've got something to work with health services on. This is what your communities are saying are important to them. It might not necessarily be what the health service and the government had in mind for promoting aging well. We've got to really listen to what people in the Torres Strait are saying about it being important. And they're holders of their own cultural knowledge and practice. So they must be at the centre of designing any services and supports that are there to support them to age well. And I think that can only be achieved if their voices are embedded into those policies and programmes. So I think another thing that came out of the review, and we knew this already, but the review just helped to kind of confirm that any programs that you design to promote aging or promote health in general really have to be culturally appropriate. They have to be holistic. They have to be multifaceted. They have to take a whole of a community approach. It's no good just saying to one individual, hey, you're not taking your medicines. It's your own fault. You need to do this. Come on, get a grip of it. That's not going to work. We've got to look at different ways of doing it. And we've got to look at it taking a more community focus on promoting healthy aging, look at programs that involve community, not just individuals, and very cognizant as well of, you know, it is a lot of those social determinants of health. It's not just about access to healthcare, it's education and transport. And a lot of the people that we were yarning with in the Torres Strait, it's not just about health, it's about problems with housing and education. So we've got to think outside the box a little bit, not just from a health focus perspective, but we've got to work with councils and look at some of those other barriers to ageing that might be able to be incorporated into health models.
Yeah, because if you're not taking care of, the community focus, the holistic thing, that leads to the health issues, and then it does become a medical issue, doesn't it? A medical model.
And we haven't really succeeded in doing this well previously as a society, I think. So we've got to listen to what they're telling us and design programs that are actually fit for the communities that you've designed them for. And I think in doing that, and I hope that is what we're doing through our work, is really taking that strength-based approach to looking what they're strong at and harnessing that strength, building on those values and skills that they hold, to try and design those programs that are really strength-based, and building people's resilience and focusing on that positive attitude as well is important.
I know in your review you included some really powerful quotes, one from an older Maori and another one from an older Aboriginal Australian, such as, he says it's important to have an Aboriginal specific program, which is what you just said, as they feel welcomed and they see aunties and sisters. So it's really lovely that you've recognised all of that. So it's more likely to have a big impact on them.
Absolutely. And, there's lots of aging well programs out there across the world, but imposing a Western designed white man's model of what they should be doing to age well up in the Torres Strait isn't going to work for many, many different reasons. The environment for one, there's not lots of gyms up there necessarily, and they don't necessarily want what successful aging is for a white businessman in Sydney is going to be very different for what a Torres Strait on a remote island. And you've got to look at the context of where they are and what's important to them. And it might not be that they want to lift 100 kilos every week, and that
seems frivolous, doesn't it?
It might be, that they want to do something more that's community driven. So those programs that you're designing have to be what the community are wanting, and that's where you're going to see the health benefits.
Absolutely. So as far as where the study goes from here, that's, from here it goes to consultation with the community groups. And what role does the government play in that?
Well, we work in partnership with the councils. So even though we're working with health services, we're also involved with councils that are up there. Some of the council members have come along to the community yarns that we've had. They're very supportive of the work we do. So the framework will have some recommendations in, and we'll go on to do some co-designing workshops around physical activity and dietary programs with the people in the Torres Strait. It's a whole kind of body of work and research that we co-design, and it's an iterative process where we then go, well, what's the next step? What's the next step on that? And it's always working with communities on what is the next step? What would you like to see? But we can definitely, we are clinicians, we're healthcare providers as well. So we've got an in the door with the health service. So very much, can talk to them about the findings, look at ways of exploring how health service delivery can change and adapt to the needs of the population. But also, hopefully government policies higher up the chain will be able to read that through, dissemination of the findings and slowly make those changes that are so desperately needed to close the gap.
Yeah, congratulations on that work. It's very valuable.
Yeah, it's wonderful. So, that's a really great study, Rachel, and thank you for coming to share it with us. Normally at the end, we ask our guests to give us some words of wisdom to our listeners. So we haven't prepared you for that, but if you could think of something now, what would your advice be to non-Indigenous peoples for how we could take a lesson from the book of Indigenous peoples on growing older better?
I think we have to listen. You have to listen to the community that you're working with, and that's active listening. That's not just listening and then going off and doing your own thing anyway. So it's really active listening. It's about listening to what's important for them and how they see any services or changes being implemented. It's not you've got to look at it through more of an Indigenous lens and go with different thoughts, a different view of ageing. I think we have to acknowledge that it's not about the individual, it is that holistic view, and things that we might not seem important are vitally important to Indigenous people. So it really is about talking, listening, and working with them in partnership to try and affect change.